Chapter 155. That memorable week. After a short tour in South India, I reached Bombay, I think on the April 4th, having received a wire from SJT, Shankarlal Banker, asking me to be present there for the 6th of April celebrations. But in the meanwhile, Delhi had already observed the Hartal on the March 30th. The word of the late Swami Shraddhananji and Hakim Ajmal Khan Sahib was law there. The wire about the postponement of the Hartal till the 6th of April had reached there too late. Delhi had never witnessed a Hartal like that before. Hindus and Musulmans seemed united like one man. Swami Shraddhananji was invited to deliver a speech in the Jumma Masjid, which he did. All this was more than the authorities could bear. The police checked the Hartal procession as it was proceeding towards the railway station and opened fire, causing a number of casualties, and the reign of repression commenced in Delhi. Shraddhananji urgently summoned me to Delhi. I wired back, saying I would start for Delhi immediately after the 6th of April celebrations were over in Bombay. The story of happenings in Delhi was repeated with variations in Lahore and Amritsar. From Amritsar, doctors Satyapal and Kichlu had sent me a pressing invitation to go there. I was altogether unacquainted with them at that time, but I communicated to them my intention to visit Amritsar. After Delhi, on the morning of the 6th, the citizens of Bombay flocked in their thousands to the Chowpatty for a bath in the sea, after which they moved on in a procession to Thakurdwar. The procession included a fair sprinkling of women and children, while the Musulmans joined it in large numbers. From Thakurdwar, some of us who were in the procession were taken by the Musulman friends to a mosque nearby, where Mrs. Naidu and myself were persuaded to deliver speeches. SJT Vidhaldas Jarajani proposed that we should then and there administer the Swadeshi and Hindu-Muslim unity pledges to the people, but I resisted the proposal on the ground that pledges should not be administered or taken in precipitate hurry, and that we should be satisfied with what was already being done by the people. A pledge once taken, I argued, must not be broken afterwards. Therefore it was necessary that the implications of the Swadeshi pledge should be clearly understood, and the grave responsibility entailed by the pledge regarding Hindu-Muslim unity fully realized by all concerned. In the end, I suggested that those who wanted to take the pledges should again assemble on the following morning for the purpose. Needless to say, the Hartal in Bombay was a complete success. Full preparation had been made for starting civil disobedience. 2 or 3 things had been discussed in this connection. It was decided that civil disobedience might be offered in respect of such laws only as easily lent themselves to being disobeyed by the masses. The salt tax was extremely unpopular, and a powerful movement had been for some time past going on to secure its repeal. I therefore suggested that the people might prepare salt from sea water in their own houses in disregard of the salt laws. My other suggestion was about the sale of proscribed literature. 2 of my books, viz., Hind Swaraj and Sarvodaya, Gujarati adaptation of Ruskin's Unto This Last, which had been already proscribed, came handy for this purpose. To print and sell them openly seemed to be the easiest way of offering civil disobedience. A sufficient number of copies of the books was therefore printed, and it was arranged to sell them at the end of the monster meeting that was to be held that evening after the breaking of the fast. On the evening of the 6th, an army of volunteers issued forth accordingly with this prohibited literature to sell it among the people. Both Srimati Sarojini Devi and I went out in cars. All the copies were soon sold out. The proceeds of the sale were to be utilized for furthering the civil disobedience campaign. Both these books were priced at 4 annas per copy, but I hardly remember anybody having purchased them from me at their face value merely. Quite a large number of people simply poured out all the cash that was in their pockets to purchase their copy. 5 and 10 rupee notes just flew out to cover the price of a single copy, while in one case I remember having sold a copy for 50 rupees. It was duly explained to the people that they were liable to be arrested and imprisoned for purchasing the proscribed literature. But for the moment, they had shed all fear of jail-going. It was subsequently learned that the government had conveniently taken the view that the books that had been proscribed by it had not in fact been sold, and that what we had sold was not held as coming under the definition of proscribed literature. The reprint was held by the government to be a new edition of the books that had been proscribed, and to sell them did not constitute an offense under the law. This news caused general disappointment. The next morning another meeting was held for the administration of the pledges with regard to Swadeshi and Hindu-Muslim unity. Vidhaldas Jarajani for the first time realized that all is not gold that glitters. Only a handful of persons came. I distinctly remember some of the sisters who were present on that occasion. The men who attended were also very few. I had already drafted the pledge and brought it with me. I thoroughly explained its meaning to those present before I administered it to them. The paucity of the attendance neither pained nor surprised me, for I have noticed this characteristic difference in the popular attitude: partiality for exciting work, dislike for quiet constructive effort. The difference has persisted to this day. But I shall have to devote to this subject a chapter by itself. To return to the story. On the night of the 7th I started for Delhi and Amritsar. On reaching Mathura on the 8th I first heard rumors about my probable arrest. At the next stoppage after Mathura, Acharya Gidvani came to meet me and gave me definite news that I was to be arrested, and offered his services to me if I should need them. I thanked him for the offer, assuring him that I would not fail to avail myself of it if and when I felt it necessary. Before the train had reached Polvo railway station, I was served with a written order to the effect that I was prohibited from entering the boundary of the Punjab, as my presence there was likely to result in a disturbance of the peace. I was asked by the police to get down from the train. I refused to do so, saying, I want to go to the Punjab, in response to a pressing invitation not to foment unrest, but to allay it. I am therefore sorry that it is not possible for me to comply with this order. At last the train reached Polvo. Mahadev was with me. I asked him to proceed to Delhi to convey to Swami Shraddhananji the news about what had happened, and to ask the people to remain calm. He was to explain why I had decided to disobey the order served upon me and suffer the penalty for disobeying it, and also why it would spell victory for our side if we could maintain perfect peace in spite of any punishment that might be inflicted upon me. At Polvo railway station I was taken out of the train and put under police custody. A train from Delhi came in a short time. I was made to enter a third-class carriage, the police party accompanying. On reaching Mathura, I was taken to the police barracks, but no police official could tell me as to what they proposed to do with me or where I was to be taken next. Early at 4:00 the next morning I was waked up and put in a goods train that was going towards Bombay. At noon I was again made to get down at Sawai Madhopur. Mr. Bowring, inspector of police, who arrived by the mail train from Lahore, now took charge of me. I was put in a first-class compartment with him, and from an ordinary prisoner I became a gentleman prisoner. The officer commenced a long panegyric of Sir Michael Odwer. Sir Michael had nothing against me personally, he went on, only he apprehended a disturbance of the peace if I entered the Punjab, and so on. In the end he requested me to return to Bombay of my own accord and agree not to cross the frontier of the Punjab. I replied that I could not possibly comply with the order, and that I was not prepared of my own accord to go back. Whereupon the officer, seeing no other course, told me that he would have to enforce law against me. But what do you want to do with me? I asked him. He replied that he himself did not know, but was awaiting further orders. For the present, he said, I am taking you to Bombay. We reached Surat. Here I was made over to the charge of another police officer. You are now Free, the officer told me when we had reached Bombay. It would however be better, he added, if you get down near the marine lines where I shall get the train stopped for you. At Colaba there is likely to be a big crowd. I told him that I would be glad to follow his wish. He was pleased and thanked me for it. Accordingly, I alighted at the marine lines. The carriage of a friend just happened to be passing by. It took me and left me at Ravishankar Javeri's place. The friend told me that the news of my arrest had incensed the people and roused them to a pitch of mad frenzy. An outbreak is apprehended every minute near Paiduni. The magistrate and the police have already arrived there, he added. Scarcely had I reached my destination when Umar Sabani and Anasuyaben arrived and asked me to motor to Paiduni at once. The people have become impatient and are very much excited. They said, we cannot pacify them. Your presence alone can do it. I got into car. Near Paiduni I saw that a huge crowd had gathered. On seeing me, the people went mad with joy. A procession was immediately formed, and the sky was rent with the shouts of Vande Mataram and Allahu Akbar. At Paiduni we sighted a body of mounted police. Brickbats were raining down from above. I besought the crowd to be calm, but it seemed as if we should not be able to escape the shower of brickbats. As the procession issued out of Abdur Rahman Street and was about to proceed towards the Crawford Market, it suddenly found itself confronted by a body of the mounted police who had arrived there to prevent it from proceeding further in the direction of the fort. The crowd was densely packed. It had almost broken through the police cordon. There was hardly any chance of my voice being heard in that vast concourse. Just then, the officer in charge of the mounted police gave the order to disperse the crowd, and at once the mounted party charged upon the crowd, brandishing their lances as they went. For a moment I felt that I would be hurt. But my apprehension was groundless. The lances just grazed the car as the lancers swiftly passed by. The ranks of the people were soon broken, and they were thrown into utter confusion, which was soon converted into a rout. Some got trampled underfoot, others were badly mauled and crushed. In that seething mass of humanity there was hardly any room for the horses to pass, nor was there an exit by which the people could disperse. So the lancers blindly cut their way through the crowd. I hardly imagined they could see what they were doing. The whole thing presented a most dreadful spectacle. The horsemen and the people were mixed together in confusion. Thus the crowd was dispersed and its progress checked. Our motor was allowed to proceed. I had it stopped before the commissioner's office and got down to complain to him about the conduct of the police. Chapter 156. That memorable week, too. So I went to the commissioner, Mr. Griffith's office. All about the staircase leading to the office I saw soldiers armed from top to toe, as though for military action. The veranda was all astir. When I was admitted to the office, I saw Mr. Boring sitting with Mr. Griffith. I described to the commissioner the scenes I had witnessed. He replied briefly, I did not want the procession to proceed to the fort, as a disturbance was inevitable there. And as I saw that the people would not listen to persuasion, I could not help ordering the mounted police to charge through the crowd. But, said I, you knew what the consequences must be. The horses were bound to trample on the people. I think it was quite unnecessary to send that contingent of mounted men. You cannot judge that, said Mr. Griffith. We police officers know better than you the effect of your teaching on the people. If we did not start with drastic measures, the situation would pass out of our hands. I tell you that the people are sure to go out of your control. Disobedience of law will quickly appeal to them. It is beyond them to understand the duty of keeping peaceful. I have no doubt about your intentions, but the people will not understand them. They will follow their natural instinct. It is there that I join issue with you, I replied. The people are not by nature violent but peaceful. And thus we argued at length. Ultimately, Mr. Griffith said, but suppose you were convinced that your teaching had been lost on the people, what would you do? I should suspend civil disobedience if I were so convinced. What do you mean? You told Mr. Boring that you would proceed to the Punjab the moment you were released. Yes, I wanted to do so by the next available train. But it is out of the question today. If you will be patient, the conviction is sure to grow on you. Do you know what is happening in Ahmedabad? And what has happened in Amritsar? People have everywhere gone nearly mad. I am not yet in possession of all the facts. The telegraph wires have been cut in some places. I put it to you that the responsibility for all these disturbances lies on you. I assure you I should readily take it upon myself wherever I discovered it. But I should be deeply pained and surprised if I found that there were disturbances in Ahmedabad. I cannot answer for Amritsar. I have never been there, no one knows me there. But even about the Punjab I am certain of this much, that, had not the Punjab government prevented my entry into the Punjab, I should have been considerably helpful in keeping the peace there. By preventing me they gave the people unnecessary provocation. And so we argued on and on. It was impossible for us to agree. I told him that I intended to address a meeting on Chapati and to ask the people to keep the peace, and took leave of him. The meeting was held on the Chapati sands. I spoke at length on the duty of nonviolence and on the limitations of satyagraha, and said, satyagraha is essentially a weapon of the truthful. A satyagrahi is pledged to non-violence, and, unless people observe it in thought, word and deed, I cannot offer mass satyagraha. Anasuyaben, too, had received news of disturbances in Ahmedabad. Someone had spread a rumor that she also had been arrested. The mill hands had gone mad over her rumored arrest, struck work and committed acts of violence, and a sergeant had been done to death. I proceeded to Ahmedabad. I learned that an attempt had been made to pull up the rails near the Nadiad railway station, that a government officer had been murdered in Virungam, and that Ahmedabad was under martial law. The people were terror-stricken. They had indulged in acts of violence and were being made to pay for them with interest. A police officer was waiting at the station to escort me to Mr. Pratt, the commissioner. I found him in a state of rage. I spoke to him gently and expressed my regret for the disturbances. I suggested that martial law was unnecessary and declared my readiness to cooperate in all efforts to restore peace. I asked for permission to hold a public meeting on the grounds of the Sabarmati Ashram. The proposal appealed to him, and the meeting was held, I think, on Sunday, the 13th of April, and martial law was withdrawn the same day or the day after. Addressing the meeting, I tried to bring home to the people the sense of their wrong, declared a penitential fast of 3 days for myself, appealed to the people to go on a similar fast for a day, and suggested to those who had been guilty of acts of violence to confess their guilt. I saw my duty as clear as daylight. It was unbearable for me to find that the laborers, amongst whom I had spent a good deal of my time, whom I had served, and from whom I had expected better things, had taken part in the riots, and I felt I was a sharer in their guilt. Just as I suggested to the people to confess their guilt, I suggested to the government to condone the crimes. Neither accepted my suggestion. The late Sir Ramanbai and other citizens of Ahmedabad came to me with an appeal to suspend satyagraha. The appeal was needless, for I had already made up my mind to suspend satyagraha so long as people had not learnt the lesson of peace. The friends went away happy. There were, however, others who were unhappy over the decision. They felt that, if I expected peace everywhere and regarded it as a condition precedent to launching satyagraha mass, satyagraha would be an impossibility. I was sorry to disagree with them. If those amongst whom I worked, and whom I expected to be prepared for nonviolence and self-suffering, could not be nonviolent, satyagraha was certainly impossible. I was firmly of opinion that those who wanted to lead the people to satyagraha ought to be able to keep the people within the limited nonviolence expected of them. I hold the same opinion even today. Chapter 157. A Himalayan Miscalculation. Almost immediately after the Ahmedabad meeting I went to Nadiad. It was here that I first used the expression Himalayan miscalculation, which obtained such a wide currency afterwards. Even at Ahmedabad I had begun to have a dim perception of my mistake. But when I reached Nadiad and saw the actual state of things there and heard reports about a large number of people from Kedah district having been arrested, it suddenly dawned upon me that I had committed a grave error in calling upon the people in the Kedah district and elsewhere to launch upon civil disobedience prematurely, as it now seemed to me. I was addressing a public meeting. My confession brought down upon me no small amount of ridicule. But I have never regretted having made that confession. For I have always held that it is only when one sees one's own mistakes with a convex lens and does just the reverse in the case of others, that one is able to arrive at a just relative estimate of the two. I further believe that a scrupulous and conscientious observance of this rule is necessary for one who wants to be a satyagrahi. Let us now see what that Himalayan miscalculation was, before one can be fit for the practice of civil disobedience. One must have rendered a willing and respectful obedience to the state laws. For the most part we obey such laws out of fear of the penalty for their breach, and this holds good particularly in respect of such laws as do not involve a moral principle. For instance, an honest, respectable man will not suddenly take to stealing, whether there is a law against stealing or not, but this very man will not feel any remorse for failure to observe the rule about carrying headlights on bicycles after dark. Indeed, it is doubtful whether he would even accept advice kindly about being more careful in this respect. But he would observe any obligatory rule of this kind, if only to escape the inconvenience of facing a prosecution for a breach of the rule. Such compliance is not, however, the willing and spontaneous obedience that is required of a satyagrahi. A satyagrahi obeys the laws of society intelligently and of his own free will because he considers it to be his sacred duty to do so. It is only when a person has thus obeyed the laws of society scrupulously that he is in a position to judge as to which particular rules are good and just and which unjust and iniquitous. Only then does the right accrue to him of the civil disobedience of certain laws in well-defined circumstances. My error lay in my failure to observe this necessary limitation. I had called on the people to launch upon civil disobedience before they had thus qualified themselves for it, and this mistake seemed to me of Himalayan magnitude. As soon as I entered the Kedah district, all the old recollections of the Kedah Satyagraha struggle came back to me, and I wondered how I could have failed to perceive what was so obvious. I realized that before a people could be fit for offering civil disobedience, they should thoroughly understand its deeper implications. That being so, before restarting civil disobedience on a mass scale, it would be necessary to create a band of well-tried, pure-hearted volunteers who thoroughly understood the strict conditions of satyagraha. They could explain these to the people and by sleepless vigilance keep them on the right path. With these thoughts filling my mind, I reached Bombay, raised a corps of satyagrahi volunteers through the Satyagraha Sabha there, and with their help commenced the work of educating the people with regard to the meaning and inner significance of satyagraha. This was principally done by issuing leaflets of an educative character bearing on the subject. But whilst this work was going on, I could see that it was a difficult task to interest the people in the peaceful side of satyagraha. The volunteers too failed to enlist themselves in large numbers. Nor did all those who actually enlisted take anything like a regular systematic training, and as the days passed by, the number of fresh recruits began gradually to dwindle instead of to grow. I realized that the progress of the training in civil disobedience was not going to be as rapid as I had at first expected. Chapter 158. Navajivan and Young India. Thus, whilst this movement for the preservation of nonviolence was making steady though slow progress on the one hand, government's policy of lawless repression was in full career on the other, and was manifesting itself in the Punjab in all its nakedness. Leaders were put under arrest, martial law, which in other words meant no law, was proclaimed, special tribunals were set up. These tribunals were not courts of justice but instruments for carrying out the arbitrary will of an autocrat. Sentences were passed unwarranted by evidence and in flagrant violation of justice. In Amritsar, innocent men and women were made to crawl like worms on their bellies. Before this outrage, the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy paled into insignificance in my eyes, though it was this massacre principally that attracted the attention of the people of India and of the world. I was pressed to proceed to the Punjab immediately in disregard of consequences. I wrote and also telegraphed to the Viceroy asking for permission to go there, but in vain. If I proceeded without the necessary permission, I should not be allowed to cross the boundary of the Punjab, but left to find what satisfaction I could from civil disobedience. I was thus confronted by a serious dilemma. As things stood, to break the order against my entry into the Punjab could, it seemed to me, hardly be classed as civil disobedience, for I did not see around me the kind of peaceful atmosphere that I wanted, and the unbridled repression in the Punjab had further served to aggravate and deepen the feelings of resentment. For me, therefore, to offer civil disobedience at such a time, even if it were possible, would have been like fanning the flame. I therefore decided not to proceed to the Punjab in spite of the suggestion of friends. It was a bitter pill for me to swallow. Tales of rank injustice and oppression came pouring in daily from the Punjab, but all I could do was to sit helplessly by and gnash my teeth. Just then Mr. Horniman, in whose hands the Bombay Chronicle had become a formidable force, was suddenly spirited away by the authorities. This act of the government seemed to me to be surrounded by a foulness which still stinks in my nostrils. I know that Mr. Horniman never desired lawlessness. He had not liked my breaking the prohibitory order of the Punjab government without the permission of the Satyagraha Committee, and had fully endorsed the decision to suspend civil disobedience. I had even announced my decision to that effect. Only, owing to the distance between Bombay and Ahmedabad, I got the letter after the announcement. His sudden deportation therefore caused me as much pain as surprise. As a result of these developments, I was asked by the directors of the Bombay Chronicle to take up the responsibility of conducting that paper. Mr. Brelvi was already there on the staff, so not much remained to be done by me, but as usual with my nature, the responsibility would have become an additional tax. But the government came as it were to my rescue, for by its order the publication of the Chronicle had to be suspended. The friends who were directing the management of the Chronicle, viz. Messrs. Umar Sabani and Shankarlal Banker, were at this also controlling Young India. They suggested that, in view of the suppression of the Chronicle, I should now take up the editorship of Young India, and that, in order to fill the gap left by the former, Young India should be converted from a weekly into a bi-weekly organ. This was what I felt also. I was anxious to expound the inner meaning of Satyagraha to the public, and also hoped that through this effort I should at least be able to do justice to the Punjab situation. For, behind all I wrote, there was potential Satyagraha, and the government knew as much. I therefore readily accepted the suggestion made by these friends. But how could the general public be trained in Satyagraha through the medium of English? My principal field of work lay in Gujarat. SJT Indulal Yajnik was at that time associated with the group of Messrs. Sabani and Banker. He was conducting the Gujarati monthly Navajivan, which had the financial backing of these friends. They placed the monthly at my disposal, and further SJT Indulal offered to work on it. This monthly was converted into a weekly. In the meantime, the Chronicle was resuscitated. Young India was therefore restored to its original weekly form. To have published the two weeklies from two different places would have been very inconvenient to me and involved more expenditure, as Navajivan was already being published from Ahmedabad. Young India was also removed there at my suggestion. There were other reasons besides for this change. I had already learned from my experience of Indian opinion that such journals needed a press of their own. Moreover, the press laws in force in India at that time were such that, if I wanted to express my views untrammeled, the existing printing presses, which were naturally run for business, would have hesitated to publish them. The need for setting up a press of our own, therefore, became all the more imperative, and since this could be conveniently done only at Ahmedabad, Young India too had to be taken there. Through these journals I now commenced to the best of my ability the work of educating the reading public in Satyagraha. Both of them had reached a very wide circulation, which at one time rose to the neighborhood of 40,000 each. But while the circulation of Navajivan went up at a bound, that of Young India increased only by slow degrees. After my incarceration, the circulation of both these journals fell to a low ebb and today stands below 8,000. From the very start I set my face against taking advertisements in these journals. I do not think that they have lost anything thereby. On the contrary, it is my belief that it was in no small measure helped them to maintain their independence. Incidentally, these journals helped me also to some extent to remain at peace with myself, for whilst immediate resort to civil disobedience was out of the question, they enabled me freely to ventilate my views and to put heart into the people. Thus I feel that both the journals rendered good service to the people in this hour of trial and did their humble bit towards lightening the tyranny of the martial law. Chapter 159. In the Punjab. Sir Michael O'Dwyer held me responsible for all that had happened in the Punjab, and some irate young Punjabis held me responsible for the martial law. They asserted that, if only I had not suspended civil disobedience, there would have been no Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Some of them even went the length of threatening me with assassination if I went to the Punjab. But I felt that my position was so correct and above question that no intelligent person could misunderstand it. I was impatient to go to the Punjab. I had never been there before, and that made me all the more anxious to see things for myself. Dr. Satyapal, Dr. Kitchley and Pundit Ramhaj Dutt Chowdhury, who had invited me to the Punjab, were at this time in jail. But I felt sure that the government could not dare to keep them and the other prisoners in prison for long. A large number of Punjabis used to come and see me whenever I was in Bombay. I ministered to them a word of cheer on these occasions, and that would comfort them. My self-confidence of that time was infectious. But my going to the Punjab had to be postponed again and again. The Viceroy would say, not yet, every time I asked for permission to go there, and so the thing dragged on. In the meantime, the Hunter Committee was announced to hold an inquiry in connection with the Punjab government's doings under the martial law. Mr. C.F. Andrews had now reached the Punjab. His letters gave a heart-rending description that the martial law atrocities were in fact even worse than the press reports had showed. He pressed me urgently to come and join him. At the same time, Malaviaji sent telegrams asking me to proceed to the Punjab at once. I once more telegraphed to the Viceroy asking whether I could now go to the Punjab. He wired back in reply that I could go there after a certain date. I cannot exactly recollect now, but I think it was 17th of October. The scene that I witnessed on my arrival at Lahore can never be effaced from my memory. The railway station was from end to end one seething mass of humanity. The entire populace had turned out of doors in eager expectation, as if to meet a dear relation after a long separation, and was delirious with joy. I was put up at the late Pundit Ramhaj Dutt's bungalow, and the burden of entertaining me fell on the shoulders of Srimati Sarala Devi. A burden it truly was, for even then, As now, the place where I was accommodated became a veritable caravanserai. Owing to the principal Punjab leaders being in jail, their place, I found, had been properly taken up by Pandit Malaviyaji, Pandit Motilalji and the late Swami Shradhananji. Malaviyaji and Shradhananji I had known intimately before, but this was the first occasion on which I came in close personal contact with Motilalji. All these leaders as also such local leaders as had escaped the privilege of going to jail at once made me feel perfectly at home amongst them, so that I never felt like a stranger in their midst. How we unanimously decided not to lead evidence before the Hunter Committee is now a matter of history. The reasons for that decision were published at that time and need not be recapitulated here. Suffice it to say that, looking back upon these events from this distance of time, I still feel that our decision to boycott the committee was absolutely correct and proper. As a logical consequence of the boycott of the Hunter Committee, it was decided to appoint a non-official inquiry committee to hold almost a parallel inquiry on behalf of the Congress. Pundit Motilal Nehru, the late Deshbandhu C. R. Das, SJT, Abbas Tayyabji, SJT, MRJ Kar and myself were appointed to this committee virtually by Pandit Malaviyaji. We distributed ourselves over various places for purposes of inquiry. The responsibility for organizing the work of the committee devolved on me, and as the privilege of conducting the inquiry in the largest number of places fell to my lot, I got a rare opportunity of observing at close quarters the people of the Punjab and the Punjab village. In the course of my inquiry, I made acquaintance with the women of the Punjab also. It was as if we had known one another for ages. Wherever I went they came flocking and laid before me their heaps of yarn. My work in connection with the inquiry brought home to me the fact that the Punjab could become a great field for khadi work. As I proceeded further and further with my inquiry into the atrocities that had been committed on the people, I came across tales of government's tyranny and the arbitrary despotism of its officers such as I was hardly prepared for, and they filled me with deep pain. What surprised me then, and what still continues to fill me with surprise, was the fact that a province that had furnished the largest number of soldiers to the British government during the war should have taken all these brutal excesses lying down. The task of drafting the report of this committee was also entrusted to me. I would recommend a perusal of this report to anyone who wants to have an idea of the kind of atrocities that were perpetrated on the Punjab people. All that I wish to say here about it is that there is not a single conscious exaggeration in it anywhere, and every statement made in it is substantiated by evidence. Moreover, the evidence published was only a fraction of what was in the committee's possession. Not a single statement regarding the validity of which there was the report. This report, prepared as it was solely with a view to bringing out the truth and nothing but the truth, will enable the reader to see to what lengths the British government is capable of going and what inhumanities and barbarities it is capable of perpetrating in order to maintain its power. So far as I am aware, not a single statement made in this report has ever been disproved. Chapter 160. The Khilafat against cow protection? We must now leave, for the time being, these dark happening in the Punjab. The Congress inquiry into diarism in the Punjab had just commenced when I received a letter of invitation to be present at a joint conference of Hindus and Musulmans that was to meet at Delhi to deliberate on the Khilafat question. Among the signatories to it were the late Hakim Ajmal Khan Sahib and Mr. Asaf Ali. The late Swami Shradhananji, it was stated, would be attending, and if I remember aright, he was to be the vice president of the conference, which, so far as I can recollect, was to be held in the November of that year. The conference was to deliberate on the situation arising out of the Khilafat betrayal and on the question as to whether the Hindus and Musulmans should take any part in the peace celebrations. The letter of invitation went on to say, among other things, that not only the Khilafat question but the question of cow protection as well would be discussed at the conference, and it would, therefore, afford a golden opportunity for a settlement of the question. I did not like this reference to the cow question. In my letter in reply to the invitation, therefore, whilst promising to do my best to attend, I suggested that the two questions should not be mixed up together or considered in the spirit of a bargain, but should be decided on their own merits and treated separately. With these thoughts filling my mind, I went to the conference. It was a very well-attended gathering, though it did not present the spectacle of later gatherings that were attended by tens of thousands. I discussed the question referred to above with the late Swami Shraddhananji, who was present at the conference. He appreciated my argument and left it to me to place it before the conference. I likewise discussed it with the late Hakim Sahib. Before the conference, I contended that, if the Khilafat question had a just and legitimate basis, as I believe it had, and if the government had really committed a gross injustice, the Hindus were bound to stand by the Muslims in their demand for the redress of the Khilafat wrong. It would ill become them to bring in the cow question in this connection, or to use the occasion to make terms with the Muslims, just as it would ill become the Muslims to offer to stop cow slaughter as a price for the Hindus' support on the Khilafat question. But it would be another matter, and quite graceful, and reflect great credit on them, if the Muslims of their own free will stopped cow slaughter out of regard for the religious sentiments of the Hindus, and from a sense of duty towards them as neighbors and children of the same soil. To take up such an independent attitude was, I contended, their duty, and would enhance the dignity of their conduct. But if the Muslims considered it as their neighborly duty to stop cow slaughter, they should do so regardless of whether the Hindus helped them in the Khilafat or not. That being so, I argued, the two questions should be discussed independently of each other, and the deliberations of the conference should be confined to the question of the Khilafat only. My argument appealed to those present, and, as a result, the question of cow protection was not discussed at this conference. But in spite of my warning, Maulana Abdul Bari Sahib said, no matter whether the Hindus help us or not, the Muslims ought, as the countrymen of the Hindus, out of regard for the latter's susceptibilities, to give up cow slaughter. And at one time it almost looked as if they would really put an end to it. There was a suggestion from some quarters that the Punjab question should be tacked onto that of the Khilafat wrong. I opposed the proposal. The Punjab question, I said, was a local affair and could not therefore weigh with us in our decision to participate or not in the peace celebrations. If we mixed up the local question with the Khilafat question, which arose directly out of the peace terms, we should be guilty of a serious indiscretion. My argument easily carried conviction. Maulana Hazrat Mohani was present in this meeting. I had known him even before, but it was only here that I discovered what a fighter he was. We differed from each other almost from the very beginning, and in several matters the differences have persisted. Among the numerous resolutions that were passed at this conference, one called upon both Hindus and Muslims to take the Swadeshi vow, and as a natural corollary to it, to boycott foreign goods. Khadi had not as yet found its proper place. This was not a resolution that Hazrat Sahib would accept. His object was to wreak vengeance on the British Empire, in case justice was denied in a counter-proposal for the boycott purely of British goods so far as practicable. I opposed it on the score of principle as also of practicability, adducing for it those arguments that have now become pretty familiar. I also put before the conference my viewpoint of nonviolence. I noticed that my arguments made a deep impression on the audience. Before me, Hazrat Mohani's speech had been received with such loud acclamations that I was afraid that mine would only be a cry in the wilderness. I had made bold to speak only because I felt it would be a dereliction of duty not to lay my views before the conference. But to my agreeable surprise, my speech was followed with the closest attention by those present and evoked a full measure of support among those on the platform, and speaker after speaker rose to deliver speeches in support of my views. The leaders were able to see that not only would the boycott of British goods fail of its purpose, but would, if adopted, make of them a laughing stock. There was hardly a man present in that assembly but had some article of British manufacture on his person. Many of the audience therefore realized that nothing but harm could result from adopting a resolution that even those who voted for it were unable to carry out. Mere boycott of foreign cloth cannot satisfy us, for who knows long it will be before we shall be able to manufacture Swadeshi cloth in sufficient quantity for our needs and before we can bring about effective boycott of foreign cloth? We want something that will produce an immediate effect on the British. Let your boycott of foreign cloth stand, we do not mind it, but give us something quicker and speedier in addition. So spoke in effect Maulana Hazrat Mohani. Even as I was listening to him, I felt that something new, over and above boycott of foreign cloth, would be necessary. An immediate boycott of foreign cloth seemed to me also to be a clear impossibility at that time. I did not then know that we could, if we liked, produce enough khadi for all our clothing requirements. This was only a later discovery. On the other hand, I knew even then that if we depended on the mills alone for effecting the boycott of foreign cloth, we should be betrayed. I was still in the middle of this dilemma when the Maulana concluded his speech. I was handicapped for want of suitable Hind or Urdu words. This was my first occasion for delivering an argumentative speech before an audience especially composed of Musulmans of the North. I had spoken in Urdu at the Muslim League at Calcutta, but it was only for a few minutes, and the speech was intended only to be a feeling appeal to the audience. Here, on the contrary, I was faced with a critical, if not hostile, audience to whom I had to explain and bring home my viewpoint. But I had cast aside all shyness. I was not there to deliver an address in the faultless, polished Urdu of the Delhi Muslims, but to place before the gathering my views in such broken Hindi as I could command. And in this I was successful. This meeting afforded me a direct proof of the fact that Hindi-Urdu alone could become the hashtag lingua franca hashtag of India. Had I spoken in English, I could not have produced the impression that I did on the audience, and the Maulana might not have felt called upon to deliver his challenge. Nor, if he had delivered it, could I have taken it up effectively. I could not hit upon a suitable Hindi or Urdu word for the new idea, and that put me out somewhat. At last I described it by the word non-op operation, an expression that I used for the first time at this meeting. As the Maulana was delivering his speech, it seemed to me that it was vain for him to talk about effective resistance to a government with which he was cooperating in. More than one thing, if resort to arms was impossible or undesirable. The only true resistance to the government, it therefore seemed to me, was to cease to co-operate with it. Thus I arrived at the word non-cooperation. I had not then a clear idea of all its manifold implications. I therefore did not enter into details. I simply said, the Musulmans have adopted a very important resolution. If the peace terms are unfavorable to them, which may God forbid, they will stop all cooperation with government. It is an inalienable right of the people thus to withhold cooperation. We are not bound to retain government titles and honors, or to continue in government service. If government should betray us in a great cause like the Caliphate, we could not do otherwise than non-cooperate. We are therefore entitled to non-cooperate with government in case of a betrayal. But months elapsed before the word non-cooperation became current coin. For the time being it was lost in the proceedings of the conference. Indeed, when I supported the cooperation resolution at the Congress which met at Amritsar a month later, I did so in the hope that the betrayal would never come. Chapter 161. The Amritsar Congress. The Punjab government could not keep in confinement the hundreds of Punjabis who, under the martial law regime, had been clapped into jail on the strength of the most meager evidence by tribunals that were courts only in name. There was such an outcry all round against this flagrant piece of injustice that their further incarceration became impossible. Most of the prisoners were released before the Congress opened. Lala Harkishanlal and the other leaders were all released while the session of the Congress was still in progress. The Ali brothers too arrived there straight from jail. The people's joy knew no bounds. Pandit Motilal Nehru, who, at the sacrifice of his splendid practice, had made the Punjab his headquarters and had done great service, was the president of the Congress. The late Swami Shraddhananji was the chairman of the reception committee. Up to this time my share in the annual proceedings of the Congress was confined only to the constructive advocacy of Hindi by making my speech in the national language and to presenting in that speech the case of the Indians overseas. Nor did I expect to be called upon to do anything more this year. But as had happened on many a previous occasion, responsible work came to me all of a sudden. The King's announcement on the new reforms had just been issued. It was not wholly satisfactory, even to me, and was unsatisfactory to everyone else. But I felt at that time that the reforms, though defective, could still be accepted. I felt in the King's announcement and its language the hand of Lord Sinha, and it lent a ray of hope. But experienced stalwarts like the late Lokmanya and Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das shook their heads. Pandit Malaviyaji was neutral. Pandit Malaviyaji had harbored me in his own room. I had a glimpse of the simplicity of his life on the occasion of the foundation ceremony of the Hindu University, but on this occasion, being in the same room with him, I was able to observe his daily routine in the closest detail, and what I saw filled me with joyful surprise. His room presented the appearance of a free inn for all the poor. You could hardly cross from one end to the other. It was so crowded. It was accessible at all odd hours to chance visitors who had the license to take as much of his time as they liked. In a corner of this crib lay my charpai in all its dignity. But I may not occupy this chapter with a description of Malaviyaji's mode of living and must return to my subject. I was thus enabled to hold daily discussions with Malaviyaji, who used lovingly to explain to me, like an elder brother, the various viewpoints of the different parties. I saw that my participation in the deliberations on the resolution on the reforms was inevitable. Having had my share of responsibility in the drawing up of the Congress report on the Punjab wrongs, I felt that all that still remained to be done in that connection must claim my attention. There had to be dealings with government in that matter. Then similarly there was the Khilafat question. I further believed at that time that Mr. Montagu would not betray or allow India's cause to be betrayed. The release of the Ali brothers and other prisoners too seemed to me to be an auspicious sign. In these circumstances I felt that a resolution not rejecting but accepting the reforms was the correct thing. Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, on the other hand, held firmly to the view that the reforms ought to be rejected as wholly inadequate and unsatisfactory. The late Lokmanya was more or less neutral, but had decided to throw in his weight on the side of any resolution that the Deshabandhu might approve. The idea of having to differ from such seasoned, well-tried and universally revered leaders was unbearable to me. But on the other hand the voice of conscience was clear. I tried to run away from the Congress and suggested to Pandit Malaviyaji and Motilalji that it would be in the general interest if I absented myself from the Congress for the rest of the session. It would save me from having to make an exhibition of my difference with such esteemed leaders. But my suggestion found no favor with these two seniors. The news of my proposal was somehow whispered to Lala Harkishanlal. This will never do. It will very much hurt the feelings of the Punjabis, he said. I discussed the matter with Lokmanya, Deshabandhu and Mr. Jinnah, but no way out could be found. Finally I laid bare my distress to Malaviyaji. I see no prospect of a compromise, I told him, and if I am to move my resolution, a division will have to be called and votes taken. but I do not find here any arrangements for it. The practice in the open session of the Congress so far has been to take votes by a show of hands, with the result that all distinction between visitors and delegates is lost, while, as for taking account of votes in such vast assemblies, we have no means at all. So it comes to this, that, even if I want to call a division, there will be no facility for it, nor meaning in it. But Lala Harkishanlal came to the rescue and undertook to make the necessary arrangements. We will not, he said, permit visitors in the Congress Pandal on the day on which voting is to take place. And as for taking the count, well, I shall see to that. But you must not absent yourself from the Congress. I capitulated. I framed my resolution, and in heart trembling undertook to move it. Pundit Malaviyaji and Mr. Jinnah were to support it. I could notice that, although our difference of opinion was free from any trace of bitterness, and although our speeches too contained nothing but cold reasoning, the people could not stand the very fact of a difference. It pained them. They wanted unanimity. Even while speeches were being delivered, efforts to settle the difference were being made on the platform, and notes were being freely exchanged among the leaders for that purpose. Malaviyaji was leaving no stone unturned to bridge the gulf. Just then Jaramdas handed over his amendment to me and pleaded in his own sweet manner to save the delegates from the dilemma of a division. His amendment appealed to me. Malaviyaji's I was already scanning every quarter for a ray of hope. I told him that Jaramdas's amendment seemed to me to be likely to be acceptable to both the parties. The Lokmanya, to whom it was next shown, said, if CR Das approves, I will have no objection. Deshabandhu at last thawed and cast a look towards SJT Bipin Chandra Pal for endorsement. Malaviyaji was filled with hope. He snatched away the slip of paper containing the amendment, and before Deshabandhu had even pronounced a definite yes, shouted out, brother delegates, you will be glad to learn that a compromise had been reached. What followed beggars description. The pandal was rent with the clapping of hands, and the erstwhile gloomy faces of the audience lit up with joy. It is hardly necessary to deal with the text of the amendment. My object here is only to describe how this resolution was undertaken as part of my experiments with which these chapters deal. The compromise further increased my responsibility. Chapter 162. Congress Initiation. I must regard my participation in Congress proceedings at Amritsar as my real entrance into the Congress politics. My attendance at the previous Congress was nothing more perhaps than an annual renewal of allegiance to the Congress. I never felt on these occasions that I had any other work cut out for me except that of a mere private, nor did I desire more. My experience of Amritsar had shown that there were one or two things for which perhaps I had some aptitude and which could be useful to the Congress. I could already see that the late Lokmanya, the Deshabandhu, Pundit Motilalji and other leaders were pleased with my work in connection with the Punjab inquiry. They used to invite me to their informal gatherings where, as I found, resolutions for the subjects committee were conceived. At these gatherings only those persons were invited who enjoyed the special confidence of the leaders and whose services were needed by them. Interlopers also sometimes found their way to these meetings. There were, for the coming year, two things which interested me, as I had some aptitude for them. One of these was the memorial of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The Congress had passed a resolution for it amid great enthusiasm. A fund of about 5 lakhs had to be collected for it. I was appointed one of the trustees. Pundit Malaviyaji enjoyed the reputation of being the prince among beggars for the public cause. But I knew that I was not far behind him in that respect. It was whilst I was in South Africa that I discovered my capacity in this direction. I had not the unrivaled magic of Malaviyaji for commanding princely donations from the potentates of India. But I knew that there was no question of approaching the Rajas and Maharajas for donations for the Jallianwala Bagh Memorial. The main responsibility for the collection thus fell, as I had expected, on my shoulders. The generous citizens of Bombay subscribed most liberally, and the Memorial Trust has at present a handsome credit balance in the bank. But the problem that faces the country today is what kind of memorial to erect on the ground to sanctify which Hindus, Musulmans and Sikhs mingled their blood. The three communities, instead of being bound in a bond of amity and love, are, to all appearance, at war with one another, and the nation is at a loss as to how to utilize the memorial fund. My other aptitude which the Congress could utilize was as a draftsman. The Congress leaders had found that I had a faculty for condensed expression, which I had acquired by long practice. The then existing constitution of the Congress was Gokhale's legacy. He had framed a few rules, which served as a basis of running the Congress machinery. The interesting history of the framing of these rules I had learned from Gokhale's own lips. But everybody had now come to feel that these rules were no longer adequate for the ever-increasing business of the Congress. The question had been coming up year after year. The Congress at that time had practically no machinery functioning during the interval between session and session or for dealing of the year. The existing rules provided for 3 secretaries, but as a matter of fact only one of them was a functioning secretary, and even he was not a whole-timer. How was he, single-handed, to run the Congress office, to think of the future, or to discharge during the current year the obligations contracted by the Congress in the past? During that year, therefore, everybody felt that this question would assume all the more importance. The Congress was too unwieldy a body for the discussion of public affairs. There was no limit set to the number of delegates in the Congress or to number of delegates that each province could return, some improvement upon the existing chaotic condition was thus felt by everybody to be an imperative necessity. I undertook the responsibility of framing a constitution on one condition. I saw that there were 2 leaders, #viz #. The Lokmanya and the Deshabandhu, who had the greatest hold on the public. I requested that they, as the representatives of the people, should be associated with me on the committee for framing the Constitution. But since it was obvious that they would not have the time personally to participate in the Constitution-making work, I suggested that 2 persons enjoying their confidence should be appointed along with me on the Constitution Committee, and that the number of its personnel should be limited to, and the late Deshabandhu, who suggested the names of SJTS, Kelkar and Ibsen respectively as their proxies. The Constitution Committee could not even once come together, but we were able to consult with each other by correspondence, and in the end presented a unanimous report. I regard this Constitution with a certain measure of pride. I hold that, if we could fully work out this Constitution, the mere fact of working it out would bring us Swaraj. With the assumption of this responsibility, I may be said to have made my real entrance into the Congress politics. Chapter 163. The Birth of Khadi. I do not remember to have seen a handloom or a spinning wheel when in 1908 I described it in Hind Swaraj as the panacea for the growing pauperism of India. In that book I took it as understood that anything that helped India to get rid of the grinding poverty of her masses would, in the same process, also establish Swaraj. Even in 1915, when I returned to India from South Africa, I had not actually seen a spinning wheel. When the Satyagraha ashram was founded at Sabarmati, we introduced a few handlooms there. But no sooner had we done this than we found ourselves up against a difficulty. All of us belonged either to the liberal professions or to business. Not one of us was an artisan. We needed a weaving expert to teach us to weave before we could work the looms. One was at last procured from Palampur, but Mahatma Gandhi was not to be easily baffled. Possessed of a natural talent for mechanics, he was able fully to master the art. Before long, and one after another, several new weavers were trained up in the ashram. The object that we set before ourselves was to be able to clothe ourselves entirely in cloth. manufactured by our own hands. We therefore forthwith discarded the use of mill-woven cloth. And all the members of the ashram resolved to wear hand-woven cloth made from Indian yarn. Only, the adoption of this practice brought us a world of experience. It enabled us to know from direct contact the conditions of life among the weavers, the extent of their production, the handicaps in the way of their obtaining their yarn supply, the way in which they were being made, victims of fraud, and, lastly, their ever-growing indebtedness. We were not in a position immediately to manufacture all the cloth for our needs. The alternative, therefore, was to get our cloth supply from handloom weavers. But ready-made cloth from Indian mill yarn was not easily obtainable either from the cloth dealers or from the weavers themselves. All the fine cloth woven by the weavers was from foreign yarn, since Indian mills did not spin fine counts. Even today the outturn of higher counts by Indian mills is very limited, whilst highest counts they cannot spin at all. It was after the greatest effort that we were at last able to find some weavers who condescended to weave Swadeshi yarn for us, and only on condition that the ashram would take up all the cloth that they might produce. By thus adopting cloth woven from mill yarn as our wear and propagating it among our friends, we made ourselves voluntary agents of the Indian spinning mills. This in its turn brought us into contact with the mills and enabled us to know something about their management and their handicaps. We saw that the aim of the mills was more to weave the yarn spun by them. Their cooperation with the handloom weaver was not willing, but unavoidable and temporary. We became impatient to be able to spin our own yarn. It was clear that, until we could do this ourselves, dependence on the mills would remain. We did not feel that we could render any service to the country by continuing as agents of Indian spinning mills. No end of difficulties again faced us. We could get neither spinning wheel nor a spinner to teach us how to spin. We were employing some wheel for filling perns and bobbins for weaving in the ashram. But we had no idea that these could be used as spinning wheels. Once Kalidas Javeri discovered a woman who, he said, would demonstrate to us how spinning was done. We sent to her a member of the ashram who was known for his great versatility in learning new things. But even he returned without wresting the secret of the art. So the time passed on, and my impatience grew with the time. I plied every chance visitor to the ashram who was likely to possess some information about hand spinning with questions about the art. But the art being confined to women and having been all but exterminated, if there was some stray spinner still surviving in some obscure corner, only a member of that sex was likely to find out her whereabouts. In the year 1917, I was taken by my Gujarati friends to preside at the Broach Educational Conference. It was here that I discovered that remarkable Lady Gangaben Majmundar. She was a widow, but her enterprising spirit knew no bounds. Her education, in the accepted sense of the term, was not much. But in courage and common sense she easily surpassed the general run of our educated women. She had already got rid of the curse of untouchability and fearlessly moved among and served the suppressed classes. She had means of her own, and her needs were few. She had a well-seasoned constitution and went about everywhere without an escort. She felt quite at home on horseback. I came to know her more intimately at the Gadra Conference. To her I poured out my grief about the charka, and she lightened my burden by a promise to prosecute an earnest and incessant search for the spinning wheel. Chapter 164. Found at last. At last, after no end of wandering in Gujarat, Gangaben found the spinning wheel in Vijapur in the Baroda state. Quite a number of people there had spinning wheels in their homes, but had long since consigned them to the lofts as useless lumber. They expressed to Gangaben their readiness to resume spinning if someone provide them with a regular supply of slivers and to buy the yarn spun by them. Gangaben communicated the joyful news to me. The providing of slivers was found to be a difficult task. On my mentioning the thing to the late Umar Sabani, he solved the difficulty by immediately undertaking to send a sufficient supply of slivers from his mill. I sent to Gangaben the slivers received from Umar Sabani, and soon yarn began to pour in at such a rate that it became quite a problem how to cope with it. Mr. Umar Sobani's generosity was great, but still one could not go on taking advantage of it for ever. I felt ill at ease continuously receiving slivers from him. Moreover, it seemed to me to be fundamentally wrong to use mill slivers. If one could use mill slivers, why not use mill yarn as well? Surely no mills supplied slivers to the ancients? How did they make their slivers then? With these thoughts in my mind, I suggested to Gangaben to find carders who could supply slivers. She confidently undertook the task. She engaged a carder who was prepared to card cotton. He demanded 35 rupees, if not much more, per month. I considered no price too high at the time. She trained a few youngsters to make slivers out of the carded cotton. I begged for cotton in Bombay. SJT Yashvant Prasad Desai at once responded. Gangaben's enterprise thus prospered beyond expectations. She found out weavers to weave the yarn that was spun in Vijapur, and soon Vijapur khadi gained a name for itself. While these developments were taking place in Vijapur, the spinning wheel gained a rapid footing in the ashram. Mahatma Gandhi, by bringing to bear all his splendid mechanical talent on the wheel, made many improvements in it, and wheels and their accessories began to be manufactured at the ashram. The first piece of khadi manufactured in the ashram cost 17 annas per yard. I did not hesitate to commend this very coarse khadi at that rate to friends who willingly paid the price. I was laid up in bed at Bombay, but I was fit enough to make searches for the wheel there. At last, I chanced upon two spinners. They charged 1 rupee for a seer of yarn, i.e. 28 tolas or nearly 3/4 of a pound. I was then ignorant of the economics of khadi. I considered no price too high for securing hand-spun yarn. On comparing the rates paid by me with those paid in Vijapur, I found that I was being cheated. The spinners refused to agree to any reduction in their rates, so I had to dispense with their service. But they served their purpose. They taught spinning to Srimathis Avantikabai Ramabai Kamdar, the widowed mother of SJT Shankarlal Bankar and Srimathi Vajamataben. The wheel began merrily to hum in my room, and I may say without exaggeration that its hum had no small share in restoring me to my health. I am prepared to admit that its effect was more psychological than physical. But then it only shows how powerfully the physical in man reacts to the psychological. I too set my hand to the wheel, but did not so much with it at the time. In Bombay, again, the same old problem of obtaining a supply of hand-made slivers presented itself. A carter twanging his bow used to pass daily by SJT Ravishankar's residence. I sent for him and learned that he carded for slivers, but stuffing mattresses. He agreed to card for slivers, but demanded a stiff price for it, which, however, I paid. The yarn thus prepared I disposed of to some Vaishnava friends for making from it the Garyans for the Pavitra Ekadashi. SJT Shivji started a spinning class in Bombay. All these experiments involved considerable expenditure, but it was willingly defrayed by patriotic friends, lovers of the motherland who had faith in khadi. The money thus spent, in my humble opinion, was not wasted. It brought us a rich store of experience and revealed to us the possibilities of the spinning wheel. I now grew impatient for the exclusive adoption of khadi for my dress. Mt Dodi was still of Indian milk cloth. The coarse khadi manufactured in the ashram and at Vijapur was only 30 inches in width. I gave notice to Gangaben that, unless she provided me with a khadi dhoti of 45 inches within a month, I would do with coarse, short khadi dhoti. The ultimatum came upon her as a shock, but she proved equal to the demand made upon her. Well, within the month she sent me a pair of khadi dhotis of 45 inches width, and thus relieved me from what would then have been a difficult situation for me. At about the same time SJT Lakshmadas brought SJT Ramji, the weaver, with his wife Gangaben from Lodi to the ashram and got khadi dhotis woven at the ashram. The part played by this couple in the spread of khadi was by no means insignificant. They initiated a host of persons in Gujarat and also outside into the art of weaving hand-spun yarn. To see Gangaben at her loom is a stirring sight. When this unlettered but self-possessed sister plies at her loom, she becomes so lost in it that it is difficult to distract her attention and much more difficult to draw her eyes off her beloved loom. Chapter 165. An instructive dialogue. From its very inception, the Khadi movement, Swadeshi movement as it was then called, evoked much criticism from the mill owners. The late Umar Sabani, a capable mill owner himself, not only gave me the benefit of his own knowledge and experience, but kept me in touch with the opinion of the other mill owners as well. The argument advanced by one of these deeply impressed him. He pressed me to meet him. I agreed. Mr. Sabani arranged the interview. The mill owner opened the conversation. You know that there has been Swadeshi agitation before now? Yes, Ido, he replied. You are also aware that in the days of the partition we, the mill owners, fully exploited the Swadeshi movement. When it was at its height, we raised the prices of cloth and did even worse things. I have heard something about it, and it has grieved me. I can understand your grief, but I can see no ground for it. We are not conducting our business out of philanthropy. We do it for profit. We have got to satisfy the shareholders. The price of an article is governed by the demand for it. Who can check the law of demand and supply? The Bengalis should have known that their agitation was bound to send up the price of Swadeshi cloth by stimulating the demand for it. That the draft was printed before the insertion could be made. The subjects committee was to have met the same evening. I had therefore to make the necessary correction in the printed copies of the draft. I afterwards saw that there would have been great difficulty had I not been ready with my draft. Nonetheless, my plight was pitiable indeed. I was absolutely at sea as to who would support the resolution and who would oppose it. Nor had I any idea as to the attitude that Lalaji would adopt. I only saw an imposing phalanx of veteran warriors assembled for the fray at Calcutta, Dr. Besant, Pundit Malaviyaji, SJT, Vijayaragavakari, Pundit Motilalji, and the Deshabandhu being some of them. In my resolution, non-cooperation was postulated only with a view to obtaining redress of the Punjab and the Khilafat wrongs. That, however, did not appeal to SJT, Vijayaragavakari. If non-cooperation was to be declared, why should it be with reference to particular wrongs? The absence of Swaraj was the biggest wrong that the non-cooperation should be directed, he argued. Pundit Motilalji also wanted the demand for Swaraj to be included in the resolution. I readily accepted the suggestion and incorporated the demand for Swaraj in my resolution, which was passed after an exhaustive, serious, and somewhat stormy discussion. Motilalji was the first to join the movement. I still remember the sweet discussion that I had with him on the resolution. He suggested some changes in its phraseology which I adopted. He undertook to win the Deshabandhu for the movement. He felt skeptical as to the capacity of the people to carry out the program. It was only at the Nagpur Congress that he and Lalaji accepted it wholeheartedly. I felt the loss of the late Lokmanya very deeply at the special session. It has been my firm faith to this day that, had the Lokmanya been then alive, he would have given his benedictions to me on that occasion. But even if it had been otherwise, and he had opposed the movement, I should still have esteemed his opposition as a privilege and an education for myself. We had our differences of opinion always, but they never led to bitterness. He always allowed me to believe that the ties between us were of the closest. Even as I write these lines, the circumstances of his death stand forth vividly before my mind's eye. It was about the hour of midnight when Pot Warden, who was then working with me, conveyed over the telephone the news of his death. I was at that time surrounded by me companions. Spontaneously the exclamation escaped my lips, "My strongest bulwark is gone." The non-cooperation movement was then in full swing, and I was eagerly looking forward to encouragement and inspiration from him. What his attitude would have been with regard to the final phase of non-cooperation will always be a matter of speculation, and an idle one at that. But this much is certain, that the deep void left by his death weighed heavily upon everybody present at Calcutta. Everyone felt the absence of his counsels in that hour of crisis in the nation's history. Chapter 167. At Nagpur. The resolutions adopted at the Calcutta Special Session of the Congress were to be confirmed at its annual session at Nagpur. Here again, as at Calcutta, there was a great rush of visitors and delegates. The number of delegates in the Congress had not been limited yet. As a result, so far as I can remember, the figure on this occasion reached about 14,000. Lalaji pressed for a slight amendment to the clause about the boycott of schools, which I accepted. Similarly, some amendments were made at the instance of the Deshabandhu, after which the non-cooperation resolution was passed unanimously. The resolution regarding the revision of the Congress Constitution too was to be taken up at this session of the Congress. The subcommittee's draft was presented at the Calcutta Special Session. The matter had therefore been thoroughly ventilated and thrashed out. At the Nagpur session, where it came up for final disposal, SJT Vijayaraghavacharya was the president. The Subjects Committee passed the draft with only one important change. In my draft, the number of delegates had been fixed, I think, at 1,500. The Subjects Committee substituted in its place the figure 6,000. In my opinion, this increase was the result of hasty judgment and experience of all these years has only confirmed me in my view. I hold it to be an utter delusion to believe that a large number of delegates is in any way a help to the better conduct of the business, or that it safeguards the principle of democracy. 1,500 delegates, jealous of the interests of the people, broad-minded and truthful, would any day be a better safeguard for democracy than 6,000 irresponsible men chosen anyhow. To safeguard democracy, the people must have a keen sense of independence, self-respect and their oneness, and should insist upon choosing as their representatives only such persons as are good and true. But obsessed with the idea of numbers as the Subjects Committee was, it would have liked to go even beyond the figure of 6,000. The limit of 6,000 was therefore in the nature of a compromise. The question of the goal of the Congress formed a subject for keen discussion. In the Constitution that I had presented, the goal of the Congress was the attainment of Swaraj within the British Empire if possible and without if necessary. A party in the Congress wanted to limit the goal to Swaraj within the British Empire only. Its point was put forth by Pundit Malaviyaji and Mr. Jinnah, but they were not able to get many votes. Again, the draft constitution provided that the means for the attainment were to be peaceful and legitimate. This condition too came in for opposition, it being contended that there should be no restriction upon the means to be adopted. But the Congress adopted the original draft after an instructive and frank discussion. I am of opinion that, if this constitution had been worked out by the people honestly, intelligently and zealously, it would have become a potent instrument of mass education, and the very process of working it out would have brought a Swaraj. But a discussion of the theme would be irrelevant. Here, resolutions about Hindu-Muslim unity, the removal of untouchability and Khadi too were passed. In this Congress, and since then the Hindu members of the Congress have taken upon themselves the responsibility of ridding Hinduism of the curse of untouchability, and the Congress has established a living bond of relationship with the skeletons of India through Khadi. The adoption of non-cooperation for the sake of the Khilafat was itself a great practical attempt made by the Congress to bring about Hindu-Muslim unity. Chapter 168. Farewell. The time has now come to bring these chapters to a close. My life from this point onward has been so public that there is hardly anything about it that people do not know. Moreover, since 1921 I have worked in such close association with the Congress leaders that I can hardly describe any episode in my life since then without referring to my relations with them. For though Shrad Hananji, the Deshabandhu, Hakim Saheb and Lalaji are no more with us today, we have the good luck to have a host of other veteran Congress leaders still living and working in our midst. The history of the Congress, since the great changes in it that I have described above, is still in the making. And my principal experiments during the past 7 years have all been made through the Congress. A reference to my relations with the leaders would therefore be unavoidable if I set about describing my experiments further. And this I may not do, at any rate for the present, if only from a sense of propriety. Lastly, my conclusions from my current experiments can hardly as yet be regarded as decisive. It therefore seems to me to be my plain duty to close this narrative here. In fact, my pen instinctively refuses to proceed further. It is not without a wrench that I have to take leave of the reader. I set a high value on my experiments. I do not know whether I have been able to do justice to them. I can only say that I have spared no pains to give a faithful narrative, to describe truth as it has appeared to me, and in the exact manner in which I have arrived at it has been my ceaseless effort. The exercise has given me ineffable mental peace, because it has been my fond hope that it might bring faith in truth and ahimsa to waverers. My uniform experience has convinced me that there is no other God than truth. And if every page of these chapters does not proclaim to the reader that the only means for the realization of truth is ahimsa, I shall deem all my labor in writing these chapters to have been in vain. And even though my efforts in this behalf may prove fruitless, let the readers know that the vehicle, not the great principle, is at fault. After all, however sincere my strivings after ahimsa may have been, they have still been imperfect and inadequate. The little fleeting glimpses, therefore, that I have been able to have of truth can hardly convey an idea of the indescribable luster of truth, a million times more intense than that of the sun we daily see with our eyes. In fact, what I have caught is only the faintest glimmer of that mighty effulgence. But this much I can say with assurance, as a result of all my experiments, that a perfect vision of truth can only follow a complete realization of ahimsa. To see the universal and all-pervading spirit of truth face to face, one must be able to love the meanest of creation as oneself. And a man who aspires after that cannot afford to keep out of any field of life. That is why my devotion to truth has drawn me into the field of politics, and I can say, without the slightest hesitation, and yet in all humility, that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means. Identification with everything that lives is impossible without self-purification. Without self-purification, the observance of the law of ahimsa must remain an empty dream. God can never be realized by one who is not pure of heart. Self-purification, therefore, must mean purification in all the walks of life. And purification being highly infectious, purification of oneself necessarily leads to the purification of one's surroundings. But the path of self-purification is hard and steep. To attain to perfect purity, one has to become absolutely passion-free in thought, speech, and action, to rise above the opposing currents of love and hatred, attachment, and repulsion. I know that I have not in me as yet that triple purity, in spite of constant ceaseless striving for it. That is why the world's praise fails to move me, indeed it very often stings me. To conquer the subtle passions to me to be harder far than the physical conquest of the world by the force of arms. Ever since my return to India, I have had experience of the dormant passions lying hidden within me. The knowledge of them has made me feel humiliated though not defeated. The experiences and experiments have sustained me and given me great joy. But I know that I have still before me a difficult path to traverse. I must reduce myself to zero. So long as a man does not of his own free will put himself last among his fellow creatures, there is no salvation for him. Ahimsa is the farthest limit of humility. In bidding farewell to the reader, for the time being at any rate, I ask him to join with me in prayer to the God of truth that he may grant me the boon of ahimsa in mind, word and deed.